Oh my goodness, I just love Ricky Byers, and she is one of my go-tos and has been a go-to for me in terms of music ministry for many, many years. This is a song about freedom. This is a talk about freedom, and it's about faith. I look at the joy and the wonderful freedom that the children were exhibiting in that expression, you know, and I think about this guy. I think about this guy because he is my great nephew, and his name is Legend. He's like 3 months and 11 days old today. And I am just so smitten with him. And at the same time, I'm knowing that there was a possibility that he might not have gotten here, or I might not have gotten here. When I think about the history of our family and I think about the ways in which we have been challenged through the years, through our ancestry. Listening to Ricky talk about borders, and I think about all of the borders and all of the boundaries that have been created. For what reason? God didn't create any boundaries. That's our own invention, right? And so as I think about this vibration of Legend, I think about, wow, he has this thing that's in my maternal side of my family that I've noticed because I know that I have a connection with him. He's not present, and I've only been around him like 2 or 3 times, but suffice it to say that there's something mystical that is ancestral that we share. And so, in thinking about borders and thinking about the many ways that we have been experiencing borders, we can go back to ancient history. We can go back to the times when there were enslaved people, of about the Garden of Eden, right? And the Garden of Eden had this challenge, right? Because they were not supposed to touch or be with or be near this tree of knowledge of good and evil, right? And somehow in this patriarchal framework, there's a woman leading the man to do something horrific like disobey the presence of God. And of course, to make it her fault, right? And then I saw that the really credible part was how the woman is the leader, and the woman is the one who is taking action and putting into the movement of life an energy of curiosity, yes, an energy of adventure, yes. But I also know that women are healers, and that even as a mother, we could see Eve, goddess that she is, right, nurturing her child, right, making a way for Jacob to meet up with relatives later to start this whole ancestry of adventure, right? And Adam, we hear about him procreating, and that, but we hear about the healing energy of Eve. And I think about all of the African goddesses, because this is very much like African spirituality. We don't hear a lot about that in the mainstream, but you see little glimpses of them that may come up in biblical and other texts. But those boundaries, whether they were boundaries of gender or boundaries of race or boundaries of culture or language, have been separating us from our oneness. And what I know is that there probably was not a welcome doormat outside of the Cape Coast Castle, where there were more than 1,500 enslaved Africans that were held in dungeons. Boundaries did not seem to apply when people were dragged beyond the door of no return in Ghana, when people were thrown into vessels naked and by force. There were no personal boundaries honored there. And yet there were boundaries like quarters for enslaved Africans on these plantations. You can go to certain places to work. You can go to certain places in the big house. You can go to certain places in the field that is designated, and you cannot go beyond this property. That is a restriction. That is holding people back. That is slavery. And so as I think about my family, I think about the strength that they've each had throughout dealing with all kinds of challenges in their lives. I think about my great grandmother, Hallie Griffin, and how she must have think about the challenges that she had at her time. Now, she did fine. She was a woman who had a lot of property, and she lived to be like 95 years old before she transitioned. And she was not somebody that you wanted to fool with. I think you can kind of tell that by looking at her. I knew that on the brief encounters that I had with her as a child, and certainly all the stories I heard about her indicated that she was not someone to be messed with, right? And so somehow, I don't know how she came to be this strong woman, but I do know that it took some faith. Somehow, she got together with this man. His name is Willie Kirk. He is my great grandfather, because together with my grandma Hallie, my great grandma Hallie, they brought into form my grandmother, my maternal grandmother, and my great uncle. And so what I know about this particular gathering of energies is that, there were borders that they must have had to encounter, because it wasn't particularly legal for them to be together, right? And so not that that was a requirement, because there were a lot of boundaries crossed when you were enslaved, that the enslavers would take liberties. But, those borders turned into Jim Crow laws post-slavery, if there is such a thing as post-slavery. If there is such a thing as post-Jim Crow, they say that lasted for almost 100 years, and that took us up to 1968, but I don't see that it has ended. You see, the purpose of Jim Crow was to legalize the marginalization of African Americans. And as we can see from the many murders of people of African descent, it has not been seen as a crime to kill a Black man, at least not until George Floyd was killed by Derek Chauvin. And there was certainly no history of convictions, right? And so here we are, moving forward into like 1930. And my grandmother was in a horrific fire. She was at the brink of death, and she was not to be admitted into a hospital because she was categorized as colored. Even though this man was her father, she had enough Black, and my great grandmother was also Blackfoot native of that nation, and so they had to somehow get her to Chicago. And in the course of that, they had told my mother that she was dead, because I don't think they knew whether she was going to survive this or not. And thank God that she did, because this woman right here, she taught me about faith. She taught me about faith because she had the faith of God, what Ernest Holmes calls the faith of God. And he says the faith of God is God, right? So when you know that the presence of God is with you, and that's how you have the faith of God. And this is that thing that I know is connected to the mystical dimension of my family line. And I very recently discovered that my mother's father has some wonderful mystical background in the history of that lineage as well. But my grandmother raised 4 young girls by herself. My grandfather had left. I don't know if he was feeling guilty about his participation in the fire. It was a mistake, and my grandmother had now distorted fingers now that she had survived, because she would try to pat the fire out on her apron when the stove was on fire, and they had to sew pieces of other parts of her body in order for her to have functioning hands. But yet and still she would scrub the floors of white people and take care of their children and do all kinds of domestic work. She did whatever she had to do to take care of her 4 girls, because she knew that that was her responsibility. And so this woman, Lucinda Cox, later Lucinda Cox Milton, is someone who taught me about faith. I could see that in her. Now, my grandfather was still in the South, and in fact, his life was being threatened. His life was being threatened because his father, who is Andrew Cox, the gentleman whose name is the foundation of my middle name. My middle name is a derivative of his name. And so they were looking for John Cox. You see, John's mother, we used to call her Ma Bit, or they used to call her Ma Bit. I don't have much memory of her. Her cousin was white. And there was this family in Mississippi. I won't name their names because I don't know who will see this, but they owned a lot of land in that area of Mississippi. And my great grandfather, Andrew, was a successful businessman. He had a lot of things going for him. And yet they did not want that Black line to continue. They didn't want Ma Bit's descendants to survive. I don't know if they were threatened to think that we would want part of all that they owned, or whether they just didn't want the shame of being related to Black people. So they were seeking to kill my grandfather, John, here in the picture, and they couldn't find him. So they killed my great grandfather, Andrew, instead. And so this is the kind of trauma that has been generational in our times in the past, and for however long that we can go back in terms of our history. So Black people have been in danger and lived in this kind of danger for centuries. You've heard a little bit about Middle Passage and enslavement and the latter parts of Jim Crow, when we start to pick up the civil rights movement. But that generational trauma exists in the Black community. You can multiply that by millions, right? But I have faith that we can be freed up from that. It's more than optimism, it's faith. This is why I've been going to vigils, to protests, to prayer meetings, to events where I can support the excellence and the forward movement of Black people. And I've been doing this from my late teenage years until my somewhat past middle age that I am now. And this is why I use spiritual principle to address the human condition. I think it's important to understand that the mind is simply a portal through which information, data, and substance flow through, substance being key, right? Ernest Holmes says we approach the spiritual system through the mind. He didn't say that the spiritual system is the mind. I think that's where we get confused, because we think the mind is the authority. It is not, right? The mind is an amusement park. There are dangerous rides and there are fun rides, and there's rest areas. There are rest areas where you can just be. And I'm inviting us into those rest areas, because it's not the place where the games are. The games are great for the ego, but they have no direct path to your spirit. An ego will keep you in separation and confusion. So when white supremacy enters the game area, if you are not armed in the spirit, you will not be able to address racism or any kind of ism, right? Any kind of misogyny, any kind of homophobia. You cannot address any of that if you're functioning at the level of ego. And so the people that crossed the Edmund Pettus Bridge, they were armed in faith. Like John Lewis said, he was going to do some good trouble, praying, knowing something greater than what they were experiencing, because his faith told him to stand for love. That's why Dr. King knew that hate could not stop hate and that only love can. And it's here in the rest area where you will know that faith gets activated, because that nothing can distract you from that truth. And so even if you've experienced faith before and you think you got your tools, your affirmations, your scripture from whatever text that you're pulling from, that is no match for the treacherous ego, because ego is a system that will set you up to be in separation. But faith will keep you connected to an energy, to a source, to a substance that will assure you and guide you into freedom, from a space of freedom, because freedom is very much the essence of who we are as just human beings, because we have free will, but because we have the freedom of spirit. And so I write poems, and I've done so since I was a small child. And now I write poems for each of my podcasts. And it's not just because I like added pressure, although I'm a little suspect based on the multiple choices that I make, but I do so because I like listening to spirit, to hear what it will say through me, right? And I have no evidence that it will show up, because there's that other thing. Principle is not bound by precedent. And just because something happened before does not guarantee that it will happen again. But I absolutely trust that spirit will show up. So I'm free to wait for it, right? Wait for it. And that is really something that takes faith, because sometimes we don't want to wait too long, right? To say, wait on the Lord, doesn't seem like eternity to me. Or it doesn't seem like it's like waiting for Godot. Will this person ever come? Will this energy ever visit my space? When I think I can figure something out, I am in trouble. But when I wait for truth, it always delivers. And it delivers in the quiet, where real truth is revealed. At least I can tell you, that's where I find God. And so I commit to listening. So for those of you who like to hear yourself talk, this might be a stretch. It's when we think we know everything, it's hard to listen. And listening is an exercise in faith. Simply being willing to listen in faith can uncover many dimensions of wisdom and truth. Let me tell you how I know. So my maternal grandmother made her transition. And I'm usually the person that would be asked to handle, representing the family at funerals based on my background of entertainment. And so I was asked to do my grandmother's service, to do a family tribute. And the veil lifted, and I was getting all kinds of messages from divine energy. I was getting all kind of information that went beyond what my surface mind thought that it knew. And I was listening to it. I was being guided, and I went in the directions that it would have me go. And I could see that the audience was just being caught up emotionally. And in the midst of this talk, I said the word obedient. Well, obedient wasn't a word that I used regularly. It wasn't necessarily something that I found myself interested in, right? At my surface mind. But you see, I had just taken a foundations class, a few weeks before it had finished. And I had already discovered in the process of moving through that class that I had gone to a deeper dimension. One time I went deeper than I thought that I could physically go. And I remember making a conscious choice to stay on this plane. And when I would go back to class, I would start saying things, and the people who were in my pod would be like jaw dropping. And I didn't know who was talking. I didn't have any knowledge of the things that I was saying. So I already knew that this was not something new. And yet I was becoming accustomed to it. And so I just played it off, and that word dropped out of my mouth, totally unrelated to anything that I was saying. And I played it off like I didn't have my glasses. And so afterwards, when people would say, "There goes the minister," it kind of shook me, because it was something I had long abandoned as a child after they killed Dr. King and after I was terrified by the crucifix. And so I had not entertained that for a long time. And someone said to my mother, "Is she going to be a minister?" My mother said no. And I said, "Well, perhaps we shouldn't say no just yet," because I knew something was going on. And because that had been introduced to me, I knew that there was an evidence of things not seen, right? Ernest Holmes quotes Jesus when he talks about faith being the substance hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. So I know with Harriet Tubman that she was not listening to fear when she helped all of those people escape. Last year was difficult because there was such a swell in racial discord, and the division was palpable. But it was only my spiritual truth that I could rely on. You see, when I landed back in Chicago from California, I landed in a white suburban community where I was staying as a guest. The owners were summering in a different state, and just a couple of neighbors knew that I was there. And I felt very vulnerable because there seemed to be an expanded number of public executions by police to innocent people in their own neighborhood. And I remember wondering at one point, as I thought about Breonna Taylor, if it was safe for a Black girl to go to sleep. And so it was not stopping this death by police. And so I had to rely on a higher authority. And I have to move through terror and trials by faith. There are things that I cannot explain, but no one can tell me that they are not real. So we need to make a choice to open up all the doors. Closed doors do not lead us to truth, to unity, to oneness, or to God. Opal Lee knew this. This is my mother, the baby who survived. And Opal Lee is a woman who was brought up in Marshall, Texas. And to the left of her pictures, you'll see my grandfather, my father's father. And actually my father's that little guy in the tie. And they were brought up in Marshall, Texas. And Opal Lee, it kept staying with her what happened with her family in Marshall, Texas, that hundreds of white people came to their home. And when her father took a gun to try to defend them, the police threatened that they would let the mob loose on them. And so while they were celebrating Juneteenth, these people came. And, when they saw him with a gun, they started throwing things at the house, before then. And then they took the furniture out of the house and they burned it down to the ground. And these people had nowhere to go. And so she had an epiphany when she was like 89 years old, right? In 2016, right? So that's like 5 years ago. And she said she wanted to walk from Fort Worth to Washington, D.C. She wanted to get Juneteenth established as a national holiday. She said, if it takes her like 6 months or whatever, she was going to do it, because she knew, she said, it's time for you to get your foot off of us. Black Lives Matter, and the other groups are letting you know, and the young people are saying enough is enough. And I think about my grandfather and my understanding of what it might have been for him growing up, because Opal's father was probably the same age as my grandfather. And I don't know what kind of terror that they experienced living in Marshall, Texas. And I don't know if that's what got them to Chicago or not. But what I do know from what I've been piecing together is what Howard Thurman knows, along with Harriet Tubman. that there is in us something that is strong and solidly rooted. There's evidence of that. Everyone in the world knows that they can rely on our strength because we are solidly rooted in faith. That is the only reason that through all of these horrific odds that we have survived. And that something that's strong and solidly rooted is what I call faith. I believe in it because it's trusted me to reveal it when I didn't even know what it was. I invite us all to claim our faith. You already have it. And I know that it is our ticket to freedom. You can trust that more than anything else. Nothing else will get you to freedom. Namaste.